All right, so we'll be continuing with the next 10 MCQs. So question 11, in which situation will it be necessary to use an alternative to the price mechanism to allocate a good between consumers? So basically where your market mechanism or your price mechanism cannot function, we are looking for that. Supply exceeds the quantity demanded at the initial market price. Well, that's not an issue. If there is a disequilibrium, then you can simply, the price mechanism through its rationing and thinking functions can go back to and form a new equilibrium and then allocate. Like that's the entire point. So that's not an issue. Government sets a price ceiling, which is basically a maximum price, and maximum prices are only effective below the equilibrium, which is exactly what it's done. So we studied this, in fact, like, so you have your maximum price, then you get your shortage, and hence you have to resort to alternative allocative mechanisms. So it's basically that case. If the product is excludable and rival, well, then it's a private good. It can clearly be allocate. You can clearly allocate it through the price mechanism. Even if it's a monopoly producer, there's still a demand supply curve. It's still a private good. It can still be allocated through the price mechanism. That's still fine. So your answer would be B, because there's a shortage created in B, and all of those issues when the government starts meddling um, with with the market, that distorts the price signal, your market signals, and all of that type of stuff. We studied that in great depth, in fact, in theory. Anyhow, the table shows the price Rashid is willing to pay for successive bottles of water, and they've given you this table. The price is zero point 0.5, and Rashid buys 4 bottles. What is the monetary value of Rashid's consumer surplus? So, consumer surplus was basically the price you used to pay, the amount you were the it was basically, if you think about it, it was the difference between the amount you were willing to pay and the amount you actually paid, which was price. So you can just go ahead and calculate consumer surplus for each of the 4 bottles, and you just add them. So zero point 0.9 minus zero point 0.5 is 0.4. This is 0.3. This is 0.15. 0.5 minus 0.5 is 0. So just add these. That would be what? 0.7, 0.8, 0.85. A market is in equilibrium at price 5. Market supply changes from being inelastic at each price to become elastic at each price. The market equilibrium price does not change. What is the effect on consumer surplus and producer surplus? Now, so one thing that what you should know, that like demand, in regular supply curves, elasticity varies as well. And we did a question related to this in the previous video for the first 10 MCQs. So when it says changes that it's inelastic at each price, it's only one supply curve that is inelastic at each price. That is the perfectly inelastic supply curve, and this goes for demand as well. To be honest, so this is, so you know, I mean, take it for granted when it says it's inelastic at each price that they're talking about the vertical curve, where this is perfectly inelastic. And if it's elastic at each price, there's only one curve that fits that definition. That is your horizontal curve, which is perfectly elastic. Any other curve, if you think about this curve being inelastic, that won't work, because overall it's inelastic, but it's not inelastic at every price, because again, elasticity varies along the line. So you have to look at these two. So if we draw the diagram, this is your price quantity, this is your demand curve. I'll draw all the old stuff in blue. So it was perfectly inelastic before, and that gave you equilibrium where you had $5 as your market equilibrium price. And now I'll draw the new stuff with green. They want to make sure that your equilibrium price is unchanged, which is why I've drawn it so. And this is your new supply curve, which is elastic at every price. So if you want to look at consumer surplus is basically going to be above the equilibrium price, but below the demand curve. And because the demand curve has remained unchanged, the consumer surplus would also be unchanged. The demand curve is unchanged, the equilibrium price is unchanged. So it's just It's just going to be this brown area, that's your consumer surplus. If you want to look at producer surplus, so with a normal curve, your producer surplus used to be something like this, which I'm drawing on the right. If you this is your price level and this is your supply curve, it used to be above the supply curve but below the equilibrium price. So let me draw the old one in blue. So above the supply curve but below the equilibrium price, that will give you this. This is your old producer surplus. Now with the new producer surplus, the issue here is that there is none, because if you look at above the supply curve but below the equilibrium price, the supply curve kind of looks at the equilibrium price. So it's like it coincides with it. So the new producer surplus uh, is basically zero. So you've gone from some producer surplus to no producer surplus. So producer surplus has clearly decreased or it has fallen, giving you C. A government has introduced an effective maximum price on rice. Which combination of changes must cause an existing shortage of rice to increase the most? Uh, so there's a maximum price, and obviously that does cause a shortage. And they're saying which combination of changes must cause an existing shortage of rice to increase the most. So it gets worse basically. Um, and that would happen now if you look at it, if it's demand and supply. Here you have, at this maximum price, you have this much shortage. At this maximum price, you have an even greater shortage. So your maximum price should fall. It should be as low as possible. Okay. And another idea is with elasticities, it should be more elastic. Let me just explain why. So we'll have to draw two diagrams, one in which it is relatively elastic and one in which, well, not so much. Now the demand curve is the same. So if you go over here, this basically is your shortage, this is your quantity demanded, this is your quantity supplied. If this is your maximum price, if you look at the same thing here, your quantity demanded increases, but in fact, to increase the most. But in an inelastic supply curve, what happens is your quantity supplied doesn't fall by that much. So the shortage isn't that potent as it would be where you have a more elastic supply curve. So that is why you want a more elastic supply curve, because here what happens is, what the maximum price does is it makes the price fall. And a more elastic supply curve, the quantity supplied would fall by a lot, which is exactly what you want, so that the shortage, which is quantity, how much quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, that difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied is more it's just basically more, right? So that's that. The diagram shows the market for a product before and after the introduction of a subsidy. So that basically increases supply, moves supply to the right, which area represents the total amount paid in subsidies. So for both indirect taxes and subsidies, to figure out per unit subsidy or per unit tax, the easiest way is just to go to the new equilibrium, find the vertical distance to the old supply curve, and that's per unit subsidy or per unit tax if you were doing it the other way around. But just remember, for the tax you'll be looking at a different equilibrium, because what you have to look at, it from the new equilibrium point. That's very important. And then you look at quantity, you just multiply that by quantity to get overall amount paid in subsidies. That's STVQ in some order. And I believe you can say it's C, because QSTV, yeah, it's the same thing as saying STVQ. The graph shows the total economic welfare derived by citizens from a government's expenditure on health and education services. If the government has 600 billion of its budget to allocate between health and education services, which allocation will give its citizens the highest level of welfare. So let's look at it. If it, let's say it goes all out healthcare. Now this would be easier if I had a scale, but like if you look, I want to look at the maximum points for healthcare and for um, education. So for healthcare, your maximum point obviously is where your curve turns. So the maximum point for healthcare is more or less 60. So you can spend 60 and it will still keep increasing. The maximum point for education is this, somewhere around this. And the idea here is you don't want to spend more than, like, I don't know, um, 35, 38-ish on education, and you don't want to spend more than 60 on healthcare. Well, you can't because the budget is 60, because after that the total economic welfare in fact goes down. So education spending, if you're spending 60 on it, you're some point here, which doesn't help, because now in fact you've lost out on some welfare, so you're way past the maximum point. So you can, and it was same with 40, so you can cross out A and B right there. Now you have two options between spending all on healthcare, which is fine if you think about it. It doesn't lead to a decrease in welfare. It hasn't passed its maximum point. Or spending 40 on healthcare. Let's do that. Let's make that with blue. So you spend 40 on healthcare, and you spend 20 on education. And this seems to be the option that gives you, well, that gives you the most amount, the highest level rather of welfare, because then you take this much and then you add it to this much, which gives you a pretty nice amount. The reason I wouldn't go with just spending on healthcare, even though you haven't passed its maximum point, is because it's no longer a straight line. Though it's, the straight line would be somewhere like this. So what's happened is you're getting total economic welfare on healthcare even if you put 60, but the rate is decreasing a bit. So you're losing out on a bit. You're losing out on all of this stuff. If healthcare had continued in a straight line. Now, if you go with this option where you're putting 20 on education and 40 on healthcare, what happens is you get all of the benefits. The rate of increase of total economic welfare doesn't go down. So you get a straight line for education, you get a straight line for healthcare, and that will ensure that you get the highest total economic welfare. If that didn't really make sense, just look at it from the other way, how you get this for healthcare, you get this much amount for education, and you add the two. If you add the two, you can just graphically see that it's going to be more than what you could alone gather from spending 60 on just healthcare that I'm drawing in brown. So you can go by it by either one of the two explanations. The table shows the demand and supply schedules for a good before and after the imposition of a tax. What was the tax and the price change? So now one thing should be obvious. Price, quantity, your demand curve is a perfectly inelastic demand curve. Why? Because with the perfectly inelastic demand curve, quantity is fixed. You could change price however you want, and quantity demanded wouldn't change. And that is exactly what's happening here. You could increase or decrease price, but quantity demanded is fixed at 340. So that makes your life much easier, because then if you draw your supply curves, the amount of tax per unit tax is basically the vertical distance between the two supply curves. And in this particular case, that would simply be finding out the new price and subtracting it with the old price. It's finding the difference between the two price levels that will give you the per unit tax. So to find the two price levels, you have to find the two equilibriums. The old one is this. Again, remember, equilibriums are where your quantity supplied and quantity demanded are the same, are equivalent to each other. So your old price P1 is 16. Now you have to find out the new equilibrium point, which is 340, 340. The quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, so that's 19. So P2 is 19. So basically that means 19 minus 16 gives you the tax, which is 3. And obviously the price change is also 3 because it's perfectly inelastic demand curve. So the price change would coincide with the change in tax, giving you B. Which action by a government would not be regarded as a form of privatization? So basically moving from the public sector to the private sector, the contracting out of the provision of public sector services to private sector firms. All right. So let's keep this on hold. I do feel it is a form of privatization because well you're contracting out the provision of public sector services. So basically you're saying that this is a public sector service, but instead of we providing it, we'll give it to private sector firms. I think you can cross that out because well that does increase the power of the market, which is a form of privatization. D, the deregulation of public sector industries to allow the entry of private sector firms. Well, that is clearly textbook privatization. Public sector industries are now private sector firms can enter those industries and gain market share there. So obviously, its market share is being transferred from the public sector to the private sector, which is a form of privatization. The payment of subsidies from the public sector to private sector firms, and paying subsidies is not a form of privatization, that's for sure. It's simple government intervention. If you look at D, the sale of shares in a public sector cooperation to the private sector, and again that is also a pretty common form of privatization where private sector is going to gain power and gain shares in this case at least. 19. The diagram shows changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply that have resulted in a move from equilibrium point X to equilibrium point Y. So what's happened is aggregate demand has increased and aggregate supply has decreased. Aggregate demand increased and your short run aggregate supply has decreased. Which combination of events could have caused this change? Higher interest rates are contractionary. If there are higher interest rates, then people save more, so they spend less, which reduces aggregate demand. Also, if there are higher interest rates, it's more difficult to take out loans and invest, so investments go down, which also reduces aggregate demand. So you can cross that out right away. If there's increased consumer confidence, so they're going to spend more and so on, so aggregate demand will increase. So that's fine. I'm just looking at aggregate demand changes for now. If there is less business confidence, then that means investments are less and all, so aggregate demand will decrease. So you can cross that out. If you look at D, well, there's a lower exchange rate, and normally a lower exchange rate, what that means is your export prices go down, which means your exports are more competitive, so they sell more. Your import prices go up, which means your imports are more expensive, so they sell less. Given assuming the Marshall-Lerner condition is met, but normally this increases aggregate demand, so D could be an option. But now let's look at your short-term aggregate supply, and you just have to look at B and D because well, those are the only two options left. Now, if there is reduced raw material prices, then what happens is your cost of production goes down and your aggregate supply increases. Well, that's not happening here, so you can cross that out. If you look at D, there's net outward migration that basically decreases your labor force, decreases the potential of the economy, and hence it would definitely shift your long run aggregate supply inwards, but it also has an effect on your short run aggregate supply. It also decreases that because now you basically have less people, you have a smaller workforce now, so the ability to supply decreases at every price level. Hence you can go with D. 20. what would be likely to decrease inflation in an economy? A decrease in consumer saving. If you save, let's use a different color, in fact. If you save less, because you have the same disposable income, you're going to consume more, because from your disposable income, you'd either save or you consume. So save less, consume more, aggregate demand increases, more demand pull inflation. So not that's not it. A decrease in unemployment. So a decrease in unemployment means that more people are employed. More people are employed, more wages, more output, but emphasis on more wages. So more wages, more consumption, greater aggregate demand for inflation. An increase in labor productivity is probably going to be your answer, because increase in labor productivity increases aggregate supply, which reduces price level, which reduces the threat of cost push inflation. That's fine. An increase in taxes on imports, well, that could cause what we saw as imported inflation, especially if you're importing your raw materials from abroad. So costs of production go up, aggregate supply goes down, and that obviously increases your price level. So you would conclude with C. And let me quickly check, whether I got these 10 MCQs right. Yeah, we're all good. So we'll finish off this paper and look at the last 10 MCQs in the next video.